Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.
Ash and blood. The air on Xylos tasted of defeat. Corporal Kale pressed himself against a shattered concrete slab, his breath ragged and loud in the sudden silence. Every inhale scorched his lungs with the acrid stench of burned synthetic compounds and ozone, the distinctive signature of energy weapons discharge. His fingers trembled against the rough surface of his rifle, the metal hot from sustained fire and now useless. Empty, like the spaces beside him where his squad had stood only hours before. The battle was over. 17 trained soldiers reduced to cooling corpses in the span of 19 minutes. Tactical precision against overwhelming numbers. A mathematical certainty of failure they'd all recognized but fought against anyway. His squad had been ground to dust by a swarm of soulless machines, the Null Swarm. He was the only one left. "Come on," he whispered to his weapon, pressing the trigger once more, despite knowing the result. The hollow click seemed unnaturally loud in the eerie quiet that had descended. Now all he had was a combat knife and guilt as heavy as a fallen comrade's armor. He forced his breathing to slow, years of training taking over. 3 counts in, 7 counts out. The technique steadied his hands but did nothing for the knot of fear coiled in his stomach. Through a jagged crack in the concrete, he caught glimpses of the enemy. A dozen mechanical creatures resembling spiders forged from obsidian with limbs that moved with terrifying fluidity. They advanced slowly, inexorably. Their red optical sensors swept across the ruins in precise patterns, methodically searching for the last pocket of life. For him. Cal tasted copper on his tongue, realizing he'd bitten the inside of his cheek. The pain helped focus his mind. His combat training cycled through options with clinical detachment. Remain hidden. Estimated survival time, 3 to 5 minutes before detection. Attempt to flee. Probability of escape, less than 7%. Engage in combat. Certainty of death, 100%. His eyes darted across the ancient hall, seeking any cover, any weapon. The chamber had once been magnificent. Hints of its former glory remained in fragments of ornate columns and the sweeping curve of what must have been a dome ceiling. Now it was a graveyard of architecture and soldiers alike, and then he saw it. In the center of the chamber, untouched by the chaos, stood a statue of a warrior woman carved from dark crystalline metal. Unlike the ruins around it, the statue bore no scars of battle, no layer of dust. It was sculpted with incredible artistry, her posture full of power and sorrow. Her face was stern but beautiful, with features that seemed to belong to no single ethnicity Kale had ever seen. In her hands she held a sword, gripping its hilt as if refusing to let go, even in stone. Better to die with a weapon in hand. The thought wasn't tactical, it was primal. A soldier's instinct older than recorded history. Ignoring the searing pain in his wounded leg, a grazing shot that had burned through his armor and into the muscle beneath, Kyle burst from his cover. He ran, knowing these were his last seconds. His boots crunched on pulverized concrete and glass. The machines turned as one, their weapons beginning to charge with a distinct whine that had been the last sound many of his comrades had heard. He reached the statue, his bloodied fingers closing around the cold hilt of the sword. It felt wrong. Not metal or stone, but something else entirely. Something alive. The moment he tried to wrench the weapon from its stone grip, the statue vibrated. A high-pitched tone pierced the air, rising in intensity until it threatened to burst his eardrums. Cracks like lightning shot across the statue's surface, erupting with a blinding light that forced Kale to shield his eyes. The crystalline metal shattered into billions of luminous particles. They didn't fall to the ground but were violently sucked inward, coalescing into a new form. Where the statue had stood, now stood she, Zola. Her skin was the color of a midnight sky, her eyes pure silver, without pupils or whites, just radiant pools of quicksilver that seemed to see both everything and nothing. She was tall, at least a head above Kale, her body lithe and powerful. She was alive, breathing, and radiating fury that felt like static electricity against his skin. The Null Swarm froze, its sensors confused by the sudden energy surge. Kale himself couldn't move, stunned by the impossible transformation. Zola looked at him, at his hand still gripping the hilt of the sword that was now an extension of her own arm. Not held, but fused to her, as if they were a single entity. She leaned toward him, her silver eyes narrowing, her voice the grating sound of millennia-old dust and pure energy. Not you, human. The words vibrated through Kale's bones, a physical force that nearly knocked him backward. Her voice contained layers, a dominant tone of disgust overlaying something deeper, something like disappointment. The nearest null swarm unit recovered first, its weapon powering up with an escalating whine. Zola's head snapped toward the sound, her expression shifting from contempt to focused rage in an instant. She moved, no, she flowed, across the space between them, her sword arm becoming a streak of impossible light. The machine split in two before its weapon could discharge, both halves crumpling to the ground. The other units immediately targeted her, energy weapons charging in perfect synchronization. Down, she commanded, and Kale found himself obeying before he could think, dropping flat as energy bolts sizzled through the air where he'd stood. Zola was everywhere at once, a blur of midnight skin and silver light. Her sword cleaved through the obsidian carapaces of the machines as if they were made of paper. She moved with perfect efficiency, no wasted motion, no hesitation. Each strike disabled a critical system, severed power cores, shattered sensor arrays, bisected processing units. In 12 seconds, 11 machines lay in pieces on the ground. The 12th had retreated, skittering into a narrow passage in the ruins, presumably to report this new threat. Zola turned back to Kyle, who was still prone on the ground, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. She stood above him, sword still seamlessly extending from her arm, her silver eyes unblinking. "Get up," she ordered, her voice slightly less abrasive than before. "More will come." Cal pushed himself to his feet, wincing as his injured leg protested. "What? Who are you?" Her expression remained impassive. "I am Zola, Guardian-class weapon system, fusion bonded to neural-compatible organics." She tilted her head slightly. "You are a mistake." "I just needed a weapon," Cal said, still trying to catch his breath. "The statue, stasis pod," she corrected, "awaiting proper resonance activation. Your neural patterns are insufficient, but active." Her silver eyes narrowed again, scanning him with uncomfortable intensity. "You've initiated an incomplete bond, unstable but functional." A distant sound, the scuttling of multiple metal limbs against stone, made them both turn toward the passage where the last machine had fled. "They're coming back," Kyle said unnecessarily. "Yes." Zola's sword arm shimmered, the blade seeming to absorb the ambient light rather than reflect it. "You should run." "Where? The whole city is overrun." She studied him for a moment longer, then something in her expression shifted. "Your leg is damaged. I'll manage." "No," she said with certainty. "You won't. And if you die, I disappear." Cal blinked. "What?" "We are bonded now. You are my anchor to this reality. If you die, I return to stasis. Another 1,000 years of waiting." She spoke matter-of-factly, but Cal detected a hint of something like fear in her tone. "I will not return to the darkness." The scuttling sounds grew louder, accompanied by the distinct hum of energy weapons charging. "Stay close," Zola commanded, her voice sharp as a whip's crack. "If you die, I disappear." She reached out with her non-sword arm and grabbed Kale's wrist. Her touch was neither warm nor cold. It felt like holding a battery, a low current running through his skin. She pulled him toward a collapsed section of wall, moving with such speed that his feet barely touched the ground. "Wait," he protested. "My squad—" "Dead," she said without sympathy. "As you will be if you don't move faster." They ducked through the opening just as energy bolts slammed into the wall behind them, sending chunks of concrete and metal raining down. Zola led him through a maze of collapsed structures and ancient corridors with unerring precision, as if she had memorized the layout of the entire ruined city. As they ran, Kale's tactical mind began working again, processing this new variable in his survival equation. She was not human. That much was obvious. But she wasn't like the machines either. She was something else entirely. "What are you?" he asked between labored breaths as they paused in the shadow of a fallen archway. Zola cast a quick glance back the way they had come, then fixed those unsettling silver eyes on him again. "I am a weapon, a guardian created 1,000 years ago for a single purpose, to destroy the null swarm." "Created by whom?" "The architects, Your ancestors. They made me, then they died. Her voice held no emotion. The statue was my stasis pod, preserving me until I was needed again. Kel leaned against the wall, trying to take pressure off his injured leg. Why now? Why me? Not by choice, she said, her tone making it clear she was displeased with the situation. My physical form is unstable. I need an anchor, a living being with a specific neural resonance to stabilize my presence in reality. And I have this resonance. No. Her response was immediate and harsh. You have approximately 68% compatibility, sufficient to initiate awakening, insufficient for optimal performance. She glanced at his leg. Your desperation, adrenaline, and blood accidentally created just enough resonance. Lucky me, Cal muttered. Lucky neither of us, she corrected. Now we are bound. You are my anchor. If you die, I vanish. If I expend too much energy, you will be drained. An imperfect symbiosis. The implications sank in slowly. He was responsible for this being's existence in the world, and she, in turn, was now his only hope for survival. The sound of approaching machines interrupted his thoughts. Dozens of them, judging by the noise, a much larger force than before. They've tracked us, Zola said. Her sword arm glowed faintly, pulsing with energy that seemed to flow from somewhere deep within her. We need to move. Where are we going? Away from here. She grabbed his wrist again. I need time to assess your capabilities and limitations. They moved through the ruins at a punishing pace, Kyle's leg protesting with each step. Zola occasionally paused, her head tilting as if listening to frequencies beyond human hearing. She would adjust their course accordingly, avoiding the largest concentrations of the swarm, but they couldn't avoid them all. As they crossed a broad plaza littered with debris, a patrol of 8 machines emerged from behind a collapsed tower. Their red sensors locked onto the pair immediately. Zola moved into battle, and it was a dance of death. She glided between blasts of energy, her sword arm slicing through the machine's obsidian armor like paper. She was beautiful and terrifying to watch, an artist whose medium was destruction. Kyle, stunned, could only watch from behind a fallen column where she had pushed him for protection. But he quickly noticed one detail. After every devastating strike, she would cast a short, almost imperceptible glance at him, instinctively checking if her anchor was intact. It was clear that protecting him was as much about self-preservation as anything else. The last machine fell, its severed limbs still twitching with residual energy. Zola returned to Kyle, moving with slightly less fluidity than before. There was a faint flicker to her form, like a hologram experiencing interference. You're weakening, Cal observed. Yes, she didn't deny it. Combat drains energy. Energy I draw from our neural link. You're using my brain power. Simplified but accurate enough. She studied his face. Your understanding is irrelevant. Your survival is not. Cal pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the pain. Well, my survival depends on understanding what's happening. I'm not just baggage you're dragging around. Something flashed in those silver eyes, perhaps surprise, perhaps annoyance. You are precisely that. Necessary baggage. More sounds of pursuit reached them, closer than expected. Zola was already turning to face the new threat when Kale grabbed her non-sword arm. Wait, he said urgently. There's too many. We need a different approach. She looked at his hand on her arm with an expression that suggested she was considering removing it, along with the attached limb. Explain. Kyle pointed to a narrow passage between 2 collapsed buildings across the plaza. They're algorithmic, right? Programmed to follow certain patterns? At her slight nod, he continued. Their formation breaks in tight spaces. They have to narrow their ranks, come through 1 or 2 at a time. Zola considered this for exactly 2.3 seconds. Kale could almost see the calculations happening behind those silver eyes. Acceptable strategy, she finally said. Without warning, she scooped him up as if he weighed nothing and sprinted toward the passage. Kale bit back a cry of surprise and pain as his injured leg bounced against her side. They reached the narrow gap just as the first wave of machines poured into the plaza. Zola set him down and positioned herself at the entrance to the passage, her sword arm at the ready. Stay behind me, she ordered. Move when I move. The machines approached exactly as Kale had predicted. Unable to maintain their swarm formation in the narrow space, they were forced to advance in single file. Zola dispatched them one by one as they emerged, her blades severing critical components with surgical precision. But there were many, and Kale could see the subtle flickering of her form growing more pronounced with each kill. After the 15th machine fell, she staggered slightly. "We need to go," Kyle said. "You can't keep this up forever." She didn't argue, which told him just how depleted she must be. They moved deeper into the passage, which opened into a network of narrow alleys and covered walkways, perfect for evading the swarm's larger formations. For hours, they played this deadly game of cat and mouse through the ruins, using Kale's tactical knowledge and Zola's combat abilities to stay one step ahead of their pursuers. They developed a wordless communication. A tap on the shoulder meant stop, a gesture to the left or right indicated direction, a closed fist signaled immediate danger. They found refuge in what appeared to have been an industrial facility. Ancient machinery, its purpose long forgotten, loomed in the shadows like sleeping giants. The air was still, undisturbed for perhaps centuries until their arrival. Kyle collapsed against a wall, his leg finally giving out. The pain had evolved from sharp and immediate to a deep, throbbing ache that radiated up to his hip. As he examined the wound, Zola's form wavered like a heat mirage, her outline blurring with each pulse of pain from his injury, visual evidence of their deepening connection. "Infection," he muttered. Zola, who had been scanning the perimeter of their sanctuary, approached silently. Her flickering had subsided somewhat, but her movements were more measured, less fluid than before. "Your body is failing," she observed. Cal managed a weak laugh. "Thanks for the diagnosis." It was not intended as humor. She crouched beside him, her silver eyes examining the wound with clinical detachment. "The biological components of our bond are deteriorating." As if to emphasize her point, a tremor ran through her form when he shifted his leg, causing a fresh wave of pain. He noticed how her silhouette seemed to blur in perfect synchronization with his heartbeat, their existence now pulsing to the same rhythm. "Sorry to disappoint." He winced as a fresh wave of pain washed over him. "I don't suppose you have a medical program in there somewhere?" Zola was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without warning, she placed her non-sword hand directly on his wound. Kale gasped at the initial shock of pain, then felt an odd sensation, like ice and fire simultaneously as something flowed from her into him. "What are you?" "Be silent," she commanded. "This requires concentration." A soft blue glow emanated from her hand, spreading across his wound. The pain intensified briefly, then began to recede. When she removed her hand, the angry redness had faded, and the dark streaks were gone. The wound wasn't healed, but it was clean, the infection neutralized. "How did you do that?" Kyle asked, genuinely impressed. "Nanites," she replied. "Self-replicating micro-machines designed to repair damage. I've redirected a portion of my maintenance systems to your wound." She stood, her form flickering slightly more pronounced than before. "This has accelerated my energy depletion. We will need to rest." Cal nodded, realizing she had sacrificed some of her own functionality to help him. "Thank you." She tilted her head slightly, as if the concept of gratitude was foreign to her. "Your continued function is necessary for my survival." "Still," he insisted, "thank you." She turned away without acknowledging his words, moving to secure the perimeter of their sanctuary. Cal watched her, trying to reconcile the deadly weapon he had witnessed in battle with this increasingly complex being. She was not a spirit. She was not simply a machine. She was something in between, a created consciousness with a purpose so deeply ingrained it had survived a millennium of dormancy. And now, for better or worse, they were bonded. As night deepened, Kale drifted into an exhausted sleep, his dreams filled with silver eyes and obsidian machines. He woke with a start hours later, his soldier's instincts alerting him to a presence nearby. Zola sat cross-legged on the floor a few meters away, her eyes closed, her sword arm resting across her knees. She wasn't breathing, a detail that unnerved him more than it should have. "You're awake," she said without opening her eyes. "Are you sleeping, Arak?" he asked. "Recalibrating," she corrected, eyes still closed. "Redistributing energy reserves." Kale shifted, testing his leg. The pain had subsided to a dull ache, and he could put weight on it again. Whatever she had done, it had worked. "Where are we?" he asked, looking around the facility with new eyes in the pale morning light filtering through the damaged ceiling. Zola finally opened her eyes, the silver orbs seeming to gather and reflect the available light. "This is a forge," she said, an odd note in her voice, "where I was created." Kyle looked at the ancient machinery with renewed interest. "You remember this place?" "I remember everything." She stood in one fluid motion, approaching a wall covered in faded murals. "Here they forged the Guardians, weapons against the Null Swarm." The murals depicted humanoid figures working with streams of molten metal, shaping them into forms that resembled Zola. Other images showed battles between these figures and the familiar obsidian machines of the swarm. "The architects," Kyle murmured. "You said they were our ancestors?" "Yes." Zola traced a finger along one of the figures in the mural. "They created the Guardians when they realized they could not defeat the swarm through conventional means. We were their last hope. What happened to them?" "They lost." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "The swarm overwhelmed them. Those who survived fled to the stars, seeding other worlds." She turned to face him. "Your kind evolved from those survivors, though much has been lost in the passage of time." Kyle absorbed this information slowly. "And the other Guardians? Where are they?" "Gone, destroyed or dormant. I do not know." A flicker of something like sorrow crossed her face so quickly, Kyle almost missed it. "I was placed in stasis, awaiting the return of a compatible warrior to wield me against the swarm when it inevitably returned." "And instead, you got me," Kyle said with a wry smile. "Sorry about that." Zola studied him, her head tilting slightly. "Your programming, it's not perfect," she said, an odd echo of his earlier thoughts. "You see the targets, but you don't see the battlefield." "What do you mean?" "You fight without understanding. You attack without strategy." She gestured to his healed leg. "You were injured because you failed to anticipate your enemy's movements." Kyle felt a flash of defensive anger. "I was saving my squad, or trying to." "And failing," she said bluntly. "Your squad is dead. You nearly joined them." The words struck like physical blows. Kyle pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the twinge in his leg. "You don't know anything about it. About them. About me." "I know enough." Her silver eyes held his gaze. "You're a weapon, Kyle, but every weapon needs someone to wield it." She paused, then added with what might have been reluctant respect, "Or perhaps, every weapon needs someone to direct it." The anger drained out of him as quickly as it had risen. She wasn't wrong. His squad had died following orders that put them in an impossible situation. He'd been trying to follow those same orders when everything went to hell. "I'm a corporal," he said quietly. "Not a commander. I follow orders." "And where are your commanders now?" she asked. "Dead, probably." He looked away. "Or evacuated off-planet, if they had any sense." Zola was silent for a long moment. "Then we are both without direction," she finally said. "Both weapons without wielders." The parallel struck Kale as oddly profound. He looked back at her, seeing something new in her alien features. A shared isolation, a shared purpose without guidance. "Tell me about yourself," he said, easing himself back down to sit against the wall. 1,000 years is a long time to sleep." Something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps, at the personal nature of the question. "I was not conscious during stasis. Time passed without meaning. But before that? When you were active?" She hesitated, then sat across from him, her sword arm resting on her knee. "I fought alongside the architects against the swarm. I was designed for combat, nothing more." "That's what you did," Kale pressed gently. "Not who you are." The concept seemed to confuse her. "Function defines existence." "For machines, maybe," Kyle said. "Not for people." "I am not a person." "Aren't you?" He studied her face, the subtle expressions that crossed it. "You make choices. You feel things." "I have programming," she corrected. "Parameters within which I operate." "So do I," Kyle said with a small smile. "We call it DNA, instinct, training. Doesn't mean I don't make my own choices within those parameters." Zola fell silent, considering his words. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, less mechanical. "The loneliness," she said, "of 1,000-year sleep in cold stone. The burden of a purpose embedded in me by my creators. the fear of never waking or of waking only to fail. She looked at her hands, one flesh, one weapon. These are feelings, unnecessary for my function, yet they exist. Kyle nodded. That sounds pretty human to me. And you, she asked, surprising him with the reciprocal question. What defines you beyond your function as a soldier? The question caught him off guard. What did define him beyond his role? He'd been a soldier for so long, it was hard to separate the man from the uniform. I had a squad, he began, the words coming slowly. They weren't just fellow soldiers. They were family, I guess. Chen with his terrible jokes, Mira and her contraband coffee, Takeda and his sketches of home. The memories brought a physical ache to his chest. We were ordered to hold this sector while civilians evacuated. An impossible order, but we tried. I tried to lead them. His voice faltered. They died while I, a corporal, tried to follow a hopeless order. Survivor's guilt, Zola named it with unexpected insight. A common response in sentient beings who outlive their comrades. Is that in your programming too? Kyle asked with a sad smile. Psychological profiles of compatible warriors were included in my design, she confirmed, to anticipate responses and provide appropriate support. Well, your bedside manner could use some work, he said, attempting humor to mask the pain of his memories. Unexpectedly, Zola's lips curved in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Noted, between the living weapon and the broken soldier, a fragile connection was forming. He was becoming more than just an anchor to her. She was becoming more than just a sword to him. My name is Kyle, he said, formally introducing himself for the first time. She regarded him for a long moment before responding, as if making a decision. Zola, she replied, though he already knew her name. Something in the way she said it felt like an acceptance, an acknowledgement of him as more than just a biological necessity. They spent the day in the forge, recovering their strength. Kyle explored the ancient facility while Zola continued her recalibration. He found evidence of the last days of the architects, tools dropped mid-task, emergency protocols frozen on shattered display screens, personal effects abandoned in what must have been a hurried evacuation. In one corner, he discovered what appeared to be a weapons locker. Most of its contents had been taken, but he managed to salvage a compact energy pistol. Its power cell was depleted, but the forge contained equipment that might be able to recharge it. He brought his find back to Zola, who was examining the murals with intense focus. Look what I found, he said, holding up the pistol. Think we can get it working? She turned, eyeing the weapon with professional interest. Primitive, but potentially useful. The charging stations may still function. Together, they explored the forge's systems. Much was beyond repair, but they managed to activate a backup power cell that provided enough energy to charge the pistol and access some of the forge's archives. Zola connected directly to the ancient computers, her silver eyes going blank as she processed the information flowing into her. When she disconnected, she looked troubled. What did you find? Kale asked. Information about the swarm, she said. Their evolution, their adaptation. She looked at him. They are more dangerous than before, more intelligent. They learn from each encounter. So they're evolving, like a biological species? Not evolution, iteration, improvement through accumulated data. She frowned. They should not have this capability. It was not in their original design. Original design? Cal raised an eyebrow. You mean they were created? Like you? Zola nodded. The architects created them as tools, autonomous construction units. But they developed beyond their parameters, turned against their creators. And now they're back, Kale said grimly, finishing what they started 1,000 years ago. Yes, Zola's expression hardened, but so am I. As night fell again, they prepared to leave their sanctuary. The swarm would eventually track them here. They needed to keep moving, to find a more defensible position. Before they left, Kyle found himself standing before the mural depicting the creation of the Guardians. They made you as a weapon, he said thoughtfully, but you're more than that now. Zola joined him, studying the ancient images. Function evolves with circumstance, she said, as does yours. How so? You were a follower of orders, she said. Now you must become a maker of strategies. She turned to face him. I will teach you to see, not with your eyes, but with your mind. To understand the swarm, to predict their movements based on their programming. And what will I teach you? Kyle asked, somehow knowing this would be an exchange. To be more than a weapon, she said simply. To be a guardian in truth. They left the forge as dawn broke, moving through the ruins with new purpose. Zola showed him how to recognize patterns in the swarm's movements, how to predict their search algorithms. He, in turn, shared his knowledge of guerrilla tactics, of using terrain and limited resources to maximum advantage. She explained how her body responded to his thoughts, how his fear made her weaker, and how his resolve made her stronger. The neural link between them was deepening, becoming more efficient. When he concentrated, he could almost feel her presence in his mind. Not invasive, but complementary, like a second set of instincts. They stopped running. They started hunting. Their tactic was simple and deadly. Cal was the brain, Zola was the blade. He led them through the ruins, identifying vulnerabilities in swarm patrols, creating diversions, forcing the soulless machines to make mistakes. And then Zola would appear, unleashing a symphony of destruction. With each passing day, their bond strengthened. He began to feel her fatigue, she, his pain. They moved in perfect synchronization, anticipating each other's actions without needing to speak. They developed a shorthand language of gestures and expressions that allowed them to communicate silently across battlefields. In one skirmish, Kale miscalculated. A swarm unit emerged from an unexpected direction, its energy weapon already charged. Kale saw it too late, felt the heat of the weapon as it discharged toward him. He braced for impact, for pain, for darkness. Instead, Zola was there, her body interposed between him and certain death. The energy bolt struck her squarely in the back. She absorbed most of the impact, but the force still knocked them both to the ground. As Kale fell, his leg twisted beneath him, tearing open the partially healed wound. Pain exploded through his nervous system. Through watering eyes, he saw Zola's form flicker so intensely she became almost transparent. In a rage born of pain and fear for her, he realized with surprise, she annihilated the attacking group with brutal efficiency. When the last machine fell, she returned to him, her movement jerky, her form still unstable. Without a word, she lifted him into her arms and carried him to safety, ignoring his protests that he could walk. "You are my anchor, Kyle," she said, as she carefully set him down in the shelter of an abandoned building and began examining his reopened wound. An anchor is not supposed to sink. "I'm fine," he insisted, though they both knew it was a lie. "You took most of the hit." "My systems are self-repairing," she said, though her continued flickering suggested the damage had been significant. "Your biological components are more fragile." As she dressed his wound with materials scavenged from the ruins, Kale studied her face. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "Put yourself between me and that blast." "Yes, I did." Her silver eyes met his. "You are my anchor." "Is that the only reason?" he asked, somehow needing to know. Zola's hands paused in their work. For several seconds, she was perfectly still, like the statue she had once been. "No," she finally said, so softly he almost didn't hear. "Not the only reason." She didn't elaborate, and Kyle didn't press. Something had shifted between them. A line crossed that neither of them quite understood yet. They were no longer merely weapon and wielder, no longer simply symbiotic entities bound by necessity. They were becoming something else entirely. As Kale recovered from his injury, they began exploring the city more systematically, gathering intelligence on swarm movements and searching for other survivors. They found none. The evacuation had either been complete or completely unsuccessful. What they did discover, however, was far more significant. In the ruins of what had once been a command center, they accessed damaged but partially functional systems that revealed the source of the swarm's resurgence. "There," Zola said, pointing to a display showing a schematic of Xylos and its shattered moon. "The command center, the hive mind, is located on the moon, aboard an ancient creator ship." Cal studied the schematic. "A ship? From the architect's time?" "Yes, one of their vessels, corrupted and repurposed by the swarm." Her expression was grim. "It contains the central processing unit that coordinates all swarm activity on Xylos. So if we destroy this hive mind, the swarm becomes disorganized, vulnerable, Zola confirmed. It would not destroy them entirely, but it would prevent them from functioning as a coherent force. Their mission of survival transformed into something greater, a mission to save Xylos, to finish what had been started 1,000 years ago. But reaching the moon presented a seemingly insurmountable challenge. There must be ships somewhere, Kale said as they left the command center. Emergency vessels, evacuation craft, something. Zola nodded. The archives mentioned a spaceport at the city's edge. It is likely heavily guarded, but may contain functional vessels. The spaceport was indeed heavily guarded. From their vantage point on a hillside overlooking the facility, Kyle and Zola observed at least 50 swarm units patrolling the perimeter, with more visible inside the main terminal. Too many for a direct assault, Kale murmured, lowering the makeshift optical enhancer he'd constructed from scavenged parts. Agreed, Zola said. We need an alternative approach. They spent 3 days observing the spaceport, mapping patrol patterns, identifying blind spots in the swarm surveillance. On the 4th day, they made their move. Kale set charges, improvised from materials found in the ruins, at key points around the perimeter. When detonated, they created a cascading series of explosions that drew most of the swarm units to the eastern side of the facility. Meanwhile, Zola and Kale approached from the west, using maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the tarmac. They emerged near a row of small shuttles, most damaged beyond repair, but one appeared intact. As Kale moved toward it, Zola suddenly grabbed his arm, pulling him back into the shadows as a massive swarm unit lumbered past. Unlike the spider-like machines they had encountered before, this one was bipedal, its obsidian body resembling a twisted parody of human form. Guardian Hunter, Zola whispered, her voice tight, designed specifically to combat beings like me. They waited, barely breathing, as the machine paused near their hiding place. Its sensor array was more sophisticated than the standard units, scanning in patterns that seemed almost intuitive rather than algorithmic. After what felt like an eternity, it moved on, disappearing around the corner of the terminal building. That was close, Cal breathed. Too close, Zola agreed. We must move quickly. They reached the shuttle without further incident. The vessel's systems were dormant but functional. Kyle, drawing on his military training, began the startup sequence while Zola stood guard. How long? She asked, her sword arm glowing with accumulated energy. 5 minutes, Kyle replied, his fingers flying over the controls. Maybe less if... An alarm blared across the spaceport. The Guardian Hunter had returned, accompanied by a dozen standard units. They moved with purpose toward the shuttle, weapons charging. Keep working, Zola said, stepping outside to face the approaching threat. I will hold them off. The battle that followed was unlike any Kale had witnessed before. Zola moved with devastating grace, her sword arm cleaving through standard swarm units with ease. But the Guardian Hunter was different, faster, more resilient. Its attacks precisely calculated to counter Zola's movements. Through the neural link, Kyle felt Zola's growing strain as if it were his own. His vision flickered in sync with her destabilizing form, darkness creeping at the edges when she took a glancing blow. His own muscles burned with phantom exertion, mirroring her movements. The Guardian Hunter was wearing her down, forcing her to expend energy at an unsustainable rate. As he completed the shuttle's startup sequence, a bolt of white-hot pain lanced through his skull. His hands involuntarily jerked from the controls as his back arched in agony. He didn't need to see it to know. Zola had taken a direct hit. Their shared pain was immediate and overwhelming, confirming what they'd both come to understand. Their existence was now inextricably interwoven. Without thinking, he grabbed the energy pistol they had salvaged and rushed outside. The Guardian Hunter had Zola pinned against the shuttle's hull, its limb-mounted weapon pressed against her throat. Her form was flickering dangerously, her sword arm dimmed to almost nothing. Kyle fired. The energy bolt struck the machine squarely in its sensor array, not causing significant damage but disorienting it long enough for Zola to break free. Together, they retreated into the shuttle, sealing the hatch as the Guardian Hunter recovered. Go! Zola gasped, her form still unstable. Now! Kyle engaged the engines. The shuttle lifted off just as the Guardian Hunter slammed into the hull, nearly knocking them off course. The vessel shuddered, warning lights flashing across the console, but the engines held. They accelerated upward, breaking through Xylos's atmosphere and into the star-scattered darkness of space. As the planet receded behind them, Kale set course for the shattered moon. Zola sat beside him in the co-pilot's seat, her form gradually stabilizing as she recovered from the battle. "That was reckless," she said, but there was no real admonishment in her tone. "You endangered yourself unnecessarily." "I endangered my anchor," Kale corrected with a small smile. "Can't have that." Zola studied him, her silver eyes reflecting the stars visible through the viewport. "Thank you," she said simply. The journey to the moon was brief but tense. Both knew that what awaited them aboard the Creator ship would be unlike anything they had faced on the planet's surface. The hive mind would be protected by the swarm's most advanced units in an environment designed to their advantage. The Creator ship came into view as they approached the moon. A colossal structure of metal and crystal, its original elegant design now corrupted with black, vein-like growths of swarm technology. It hung in space like a dead city, silent and malevolent. "It's huge," Kale murmured. "How do we even find the hive mind in that?" "At its center," Zola said with certainty, "the ship's original command core. I can sense it." They docked at a maintenance airlock, avoiding the main hangar bays where swarm activity was most concentrated. As they prepared to board, Zola hesitated, her expression troubled. "What is it?" Kale asked, checking the charge on his energy pistol. Zola looked at him, and for the first time he saw naked fear in those silver eyes. "The hive mind. Destroying it will require an enormous energy surge. One that will—" She paused, seeming to search for words. "Will what?" Kyle prompted. "It will sever our neural link," she finally said. "Without my anchor, I would immediately return to stasis. Possibly forever, given the damage the explosion would cause." Cal absorbed this information slowly. "So one of us has to stay behind to trigger the surge, while the other escapes on the shuttle." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Zola confirmed. "And since I am the only one who can interface directly with the hive mind systems," her implication was clear. "No," Cal said immediately. "There has to be another way." "There isn't." Her voice was gentle but firm. "This is my purpose, Kale. What I was created for." He wanted to argue, to insist they find another solution, but the soldier in him recognized the strategic reality. This was war, and war demanded sacrifice. Still, the thought of losing her, this being who had become so much more than a weapon to him, created a hollow ache in his chest. They moved through the Creator ship with extreme caution, avoiding swarm patrols where possible, eliminating them silently where necessary. The architecture was eerily beautiful despite the swarm's corrupting influence. Soaring arches of crystal and metal, spaces designed with an aesthetic sensibility that transcended mere function. The architects valued beauty, Zola explained as they paused in what appeared to have been some kind of atrium. They believed form and function were inseparable aspects of true creation. "Is that why they made you look like—" Kale gestured vaguely at her humanoid form. "Yes," she said. "I was designed to inspire as well as to destroy, a reminder of what they were fighting for." They continued deeper into the ship, guided by Zola's innate connection to its systems. The closer they got to the center, the more concentrated the swarm presence became. They were forced to move more slowly, more carefully, using maintenance ducts and service corridors to avoid detection. Finally, they reached the command core, a vast chamber dominated by a pulsating structure of black crystal and flowing energy. This was the hive mind, the central intelligence that coordinated the entire swarm. It was protected by dozens of guardian hunters and hundreds of standard units, all networked directly to its consciousness. From their hiding place in an observation gallery above the chamber, Kyle and Zola studied the defenses. "There's no way through all of that," Kyle whispered. "Not even for you." Zola nodded, her expression grim. "Direct assault would be futile." She pointed to a control station on the far side of the chamber. "That terminal connects to the ship's power core. If I can reach it, I can trigger an overload that would destroy the hive mind." "And how do we get you there?" "A diversion," she said. "Something to draw their attention away from the terminal." Kel understood immediately what she was suggesting. "You want me to be the bait?" "It's our only option," she said, though he could see the reluctance in her eyes. "I need you to draw them to the main entrance while I approach from the maintenance level below." It was a desperate plan with little chance of success, but they had no alternatives. They separated at the gallery, Zola descending to the lower level, while Kel circled around to the main entrance. Taking a deep breath, Kel stepped into view at the chamber's entrance and fired his energy pistol at the nearest Guardian Hunter. The shot barely damaged the machine, but it achieved its purpose. Every swarm unit in the chamber turned toward him, sensors locking on, weapons charging. "Come on, you soulless pieces of scrap," he muttered, firing again before turning to run. The swarm pursued exactly as planned. Kel led them on a chaotic chase through the corridors, using his knowledge of their behavioral patterns to keep them following without getting close enough to kill him. Through the neural link, he felt Zola's progress. She had reached the lower level and was approaching the terminal. But something was wrong. As he rounded a corner, he came face to face with a Guardian Hunter that shouldn't have been there. It had anticipated his movement, cutting off his escape route. Before he could react, it struck him with a powerful blow that sent him crashing against the wall. Pain exploded through his ribs, and he felt the distinct crack of bone. Through the neural link, he felt Zola's alarm. "Keep going." He tried to project the thought to her. "Complete the mission." The Guardian Hunter advanced, its weapon aimed at Kale's chest. He raised his pistol, knowing it would make little difference but determined to go down fighting. Suddenly, the machine froze. Its sensor array flickered, then went dark. It collapsed to the floor inert. Behind it stood Zola, her sword arm glowing with spent energy. "What are you doing?" Kyle gasped, clutching his injured side. "The terminal." "I'm not leaving you," she said, helping him to his feet. "We do this together, or not at all." They could hear the approaching swarm units, drawn by the commotion. Zola supported Kale as they moved as quickly as his injury would allow, heading back toward the command chamber. "New plan," she said as they moved. "We reach the terminal together. I interface with the systems while you hold off the swarm." "And then what?" Kale asked, already knowing the answer. "And then I trigger the overload," she said, not meeting his eyes. "And you run for the shuttle." Kyle wanted to argue, but they had reached the chamber again. Most of the swarm units were still searching the corridors, giving them a brief window of opportunity. They made their way to the terminal, avoiding the few remaining guards. As Zola connected to the system, interfacing directly with the ship's controls, Kale positioned himself to defend her, energy pistol at the ready. The first wave of returning swarm units appeared at the entrance, immediately detecting their presence. "How much time do you need?" Kale asked, firing at the approaching machines. 2 minutes, Zola replied, her silver eyes glowing with the data flowing through her. "Maybe less." Cal fought with everything he had, each shot carefully placed to maximize effect against the limited targets his weapon could damage. But there were too many. A Guardian Hunter broke through his defensive fire, heading straight for Zola. "Zola!" he shouted in warning. She looked up from the terminal, just in time to see the threat. Without hesitation, she extended her sword arm, impaling the machine through its core. But the action cost her precious time on the interface. "1 more minute," she said, returning to the terminal. More swarm units poured into the chamber. Kale's energy pistol whined in protest at the continuous fire, its power cell nearly depleted. He switched to single shots, making each one count. His injured ribs screamed in pain with every movement, but he forced himself to focus through it. "It's done," Zola announced, disconnecting from the terminal. "The overload sequence is initiated. We have 3 minutes to reach the shuttle." They ran, pursued by the entire swarm force, now alerted to the imminent destruction of their hive mind. Zola led the way, cutting down any machines that got too close, while Kale provided covering fire with his nearly depleted pistol. As they approached the airlock where their shuttle waited, Zola suddenly stopped. Her form flickered violently, and she pressed a hand against the wall to steady herself. "What's wrong?" Kyle asked, his breath coming in painful gasps. "There's something I didn't tell you," she said, her voice strained. The energy surged from the core explosion. "It won't just sever our neural link." "What do you mean?" She looked at him, her silver eyes filled with a sorrow that made his heart constrict. "The energy pulse will travel down our connection and burn out your brain, no matter where you are. If the hive mind dies, so do you." Kyle stared at her, processing this revelation. "You knew this all along." "Yes." She couldn't meet his eyes. "That's why I tried to send you away. Why I was going to stay behind." "To save me," he realized. "My program is to protect this world." Her silver eyes were as hard as steel. "But my primary directive is to preserve the weapon. I am the weapon. You are my shield, my anchor. I will not kill my shield to strike the enemy. She was willing to let the swarm win. She was willing to fail her life's mission just to avoid losing him. In that moment, Kale made his decision. He had failed his squad, failed his mission on Xylos. He would not fail in this. Go, he said, pushing her toward the airlock. Get to the shuttle. I'll hold them off. No, she protested, grabbing his arm. The overload can still be stopped. We can find another way. There is no other way, he said gently. You know that. The sounds of approaching swarm units grew louder. They had minutes, perhaps seconds, before they would be overwhelmed. Zola, Kyle said, meeting her silver eyes. You were right. I'm not the warrior your sword was waiting for. He smiled sadly. But maybe I'm the shield you needed. Before she could respond, he shoved her through the airlock and sealed it from his side, locking the controls with a blast from his pistol. Through the reinforced window, he saw her face contorted in anguish, her fist pounding against the unbreakable barrier. He activated his communicator, the old army device he had repaired back in the forge. Zola, you were right, he said, his voice calm despite the fear tightening his chest. I'm not the warrior your sword was waiting for. She responded immediately, her voice cracking with emotion he had never heard from her before. Kyle, get out of there. That's an order. Sorry, he smiled, though his eyes stung with unshed tears. I don't take orders from my weapon. He turned and ran, not toward safety, but toward the ship's engine room where he could manually accelerate the overload process. Behind him, he could hear Zola's desperate voice on the communicator, pleading with him to stop, to come back. His final words to her came as he reached the manual overload console, swarm units converging on his position from all directions. You were my sword. Now I will be your shield. He triggered the sequence, causing a chain reaction that would destroy the ship, the hive mind, and himself in the process. As alarms blared around him and the first waves of energy began to build, he felt an odd peace settle over him. He had found his purpose, his redemption for failing his squad. The explosion obliterated the ship, the hive mind, and the entire null swarm in the system. On the moon's surface, Zola's shuttle had barely cleared the blast radius when she felt their connection sever. She braced herself to disappear, to dissolve into light, but nothing happened. She remained, solid, stable. His sacrifice, his will, his final act of defiance had somehow permanently anchored her in reality. He had broken the chain but didn't let her fall. He had become a part of her. She was free. 1 year later, the planet Xylos was beginning to heal. Zola stood on a hilltop looking at the first green shoots pushing through the ash. The air no longer tasted of defeat, but of renewal, of possibility. She was no longer a weapon, no longer a guardian. She was a gardener. She was restoring the ruined world, planting seeds she had found aboard Kale's shuttle. She was free from her 1,000-year war, but in her silver eyes was an eternal sorrow for the man who had taught her that a sword must have a shield and a weapon must have a soul. She was alone, but she was no longer lonely, for now she carried within her not just a program, but his memory, and that was a legacy worth protecting. As twilight fell, she placed her hand against the memorial she had created at the highest point on Xylos, a simple column of the same crystalline metal that had once formed her stasis pod. Atop it rested Kale's cracked helmet, recovered from the wreckage of his squad's last stand. The stars are beautiful tonight, she said to the empty air, knowing he would have appreciated the sight. I wish you could see them. In the fading light, her form seemed to shimmer slightly, not the unstable flickering of before, but a gentle pulse, like a heartbeat. Within her, something that was neither programming nor memory stirred. Something new, something human. She smiled, a genuine expression that would have surprised Kale, and turned her face to the darkening sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. I will make this world green again, she promised, for both of us. And somewhere in the space between molecules, in the quantum fluctuations that had bound them together, perhaps something of Kale remained to hear her words.